I taught my first dystopian fiction, 1984, to 10th graders in Bulgaria. They had very strong reactions to the way Orwell portrayed communism, since communist rule had existed in their families' living memories. For some, Orwell nailed it. Others, outraged, clearly thought he was slandering their country's history. For everyone, the line between fiction and fact in the text felt blurry. Perhaps because of its intensity, its emotional nature, its closeness to actual events, they found it didn't read as just plain old fiction. Thinking back, I'd now say they felt it was fiction with an agenda. Fiction with a clear argument that used evidence like characterization, setting, tone, and mood to drive home its thesis. That experience has flavored the way I've read all the dystopia I've picked up since. Fahrenheit 451, The Hunger Games, Scythe, Dry. And I think it leads to fascinating questions to bring to kids. How does dystopia wield its influence? Where is the line between art and propaganda? What do dystopian authors have in their writing arsenal that other authors don't? Today, I hope to convince you that dystopian book clubs are worth your time and give you the building blocks to design your unit. We're going to talk texts, activities, and assessment possibilities. Welcome to the Spark Creativity Teacher Podcast, a podcast for English teachers looking for more. More creativity, more engagement, more joy, and no more scripted curriculum, lesson planning ruts, or boring book lists. I'm Betsy Potash, and I'm honored you're trusting me to help. You're not alone on this creative journey anymore. First things first, let's talk about dystopian book club text options. Before we dive in, I have to say, as usual, remember to preview book choices to make sure they're a good fit for your community. A lot of dystopian novels contain mature themes and violence as part of the nature of the book. There's kind of no way around it. So you have to decide if you can set the context and if you can make it feel right for your group of kids in your community. When it comes to dystopia, there are a few classics and a lot of popular contemporary options. There was kind of a dystopian boom a few years ago. For middle school, Animal Farm and The Giver are frequent go-tos for dystopia, and I want to note that there's a pretty cool graphic novel version of The Giver, so I'd recommend checking that out. Also, there's a recent, more literary fiction dystopia / indigenous futurism book called A Snake Falls to Earth that could be a really neat new possibility in that kind of literary category. For high school, you've got a few more options in terms of literary texts. You could bring in Fahrenheit 451, 1984. You could also bring in Sherry DeMaline's The Marrow Thieves. If you do, you'd want to provide some context about the tragedy of Canadian residential schools. You know what I'm talking about if you've read that book. There's some needed history to go with that book that you'd want to provide to the group and talk them through a little bit. For either group, middle school or high school, depending on reading level, depending on interest, there's this wealth of more recent, highly compelling YA fiction like The Hunger Games, Uglies, Scythe, and Divergent. Plus, for a little bit older kids, maybe the book Dry or the new prequel to The Hunger Games, The Ballad of Songbird and Snakes. Depending on your class, you could either provide literary fiction and YA options for your book clubs and let kids self-select based on their kind of level of challenge that they want and the type of topic they're interested in. Or you could focus on one or the other, go all sort of more canonical or go all more YA, depending on the rest of your curriculum. Or maybe you want to choose the more literary fiction options, but then really showcase those other contemporary dystopian texts in your book trailer Tuesdays, in your first chapter Fridays, in your choice reading displays throughout the unit. So if kids get that spark of interest in dystopia, they have a bunch of other avenues to explore it. Okay, next let's talk about an activity to get started with your book clubs. One fun way to hook students and get them thinking about how to define dystopia is to show them some dystopian film trailers before launching your book clubs. And then ask them to be watching these trailers for what makes dystopia dystopia. Suggest that they watch for plot elements, setting, and mood as they view the trailers, and just kind of be jotting down characteristics for each before you discuss what makes dystopia dystopia. There are so many film trailers you could use for this. I have watched a ton, and really it's quite interesting that the trailers are so quick and they provide such a strong punch of dystopia in a short time that it's a really impactful activity. So here are just a few options. There's The Mitchells versus the Machines, which is a pretty recent film in which AI kind of takes over the world. Definitely interesting for students to see right now. There's The Truman Show, which takes us back, where Jim Carrey is like the subject of a reality show and he doesn't know it. There's The Giver, classic. There's Fahrenheit 451, classic. There's Divergent or The Hunger Games, some of those more popular contemporary dystopian. If you have high school students, you might consider The Matrix. There are a ton of dystopian film trailers, and it's really an interesting activity. Once you've watched a few, you can have kids kind of look at all their characteristics and come up with a definition in pairs or small groups. And then you can come up with a class definition, which you can either leave on the board or put on some kind of big anchor chart paper on your wall to keep up throughout the unit. Okay, so now you've kind of laid some groundwork. Kids are starting to think about dystopia. A good next activity in the unit would be a book tasting. And we've talked about that quite a bit on here before. You probably already know what a book tasting is like. You put up a fun sign to welcome them to your room, like project something big on your smartboard or your whiteboard that says dystopian book tasting, play some themed music, something intense for dystopia, and then you scatter your book options for your unit onto the tables around the room. If you want to have some beverages or something, you can, and then you invite students to move around, jot down ratings, details about each book in the book tasting. So they can kind of consider, okay, would I rather read Fahrenheit 451? Am I intrigued by the fact that it's been banned? Am I interested in this idea of sort of what role do books play in my society? Or, I've always wanted to read The Hunger Games, but I've never had time. Whatever. They walk around, they look at the books, and then they sign up. And you can either have them sign up sort of on the spot. This is what I've done in the past. I have students move to different areas of the room based on their preference. And then if I have like a giant group with one book, I try to appeal to their interests. I say you're underestimating this other book that has 2 people at the group. Like, it's so fascinating for these reasons, X, Y, Z, and I see if I can move some over. Now, if you don't want to deal with that kind of on the fly shifting and you're afraid everybody's going to pick the same book, you can have them sign up in writing and then you can assign the groups overnight. Okay, the next thing I would suggest is to let kids meet briefly in their groups to assign the reading. With dystopian book clubs or any book clubs, I wouldn't have your students have a meeting every day. I think it can get old fast and it becomes just sort of like, okay, we're having a book club meeting. I would suggest just having 2 or 3 book club meetings a week. And that way your students have more time to read a larger amount of reading in between, and it'll give you time to continue with other priorities in your curriculum. Maybe that's a writing lesson on a Wednesday or a Genius Hour project on a Monday or choice reading on Friday. If you have your book clubs Tuesday, Thursday for 3 weeks, that can keep it fresh and give you that time for other things as well. So let kids meet, break up their reading, plan to finish it by the end of the unit, and then they'll be ready to go into their first meeting the next time. Okay, so as you're kicking off your first book club meeting and your students have read a little chunk of reading, or maybe even before they read their first little chunk of reading, if you're interested in the same question that I'm interested in about dystopia and how it influences people, you might want to seed that question very early on. So you're going to talk to them about this idea that dystopia as a genre provides a unique opportunity for an author to present an argument through fiction. And so I have found a couple of really interesting commercials that I think can help students start to think, how does the idea of dystopia, the setting of dystopia, the mood of dystopia create influence? And if you show them these two commercials, you can have this conversation based on, something really short, a little snatch, before they even have read very much. And there are two commercials, which I'm going to link for you. One is from Apple, and it's the very first commercial that introduced the Apple computer. And it shows a 1984 scenario with a bunch of people like staring at a screen with Big Brother talking. And then this woman comes running in and like smashes Big Brother's screen with a hammer. And she's like, the messenger for the new Apple computer. And it says like, Apple computer is coming, find out why 1984 isn't going to be like 1984. And so it's a brand message that uses dystopia as its vehicle. And then years later, Motorola made a commercial for one of their devices that sort of hits back at the Apple computer commercial. And it also shows a dystopia, but the dystopia is very kind of themed as if it was a world in which Apple dominated everything. And then Motorola is the one that creates this ripple of change within the dystopia. So I'm going to link those two commercials because I think they're really interesting as a platform for bringing up this question. And then you can talk to students about influence. What does it mean to try to influence someone? What kind of books, movies, podcasts, commercials, pieces of art have they seen that influence the way they think about the world? And then bringing up a step further, what is propaganda? What's the difference between art that seeks to influence and marketing and propaganda? Because they're all kind of going at something a little bit similar, but what's the difference? So if you're interested in these questions like me and you want to build your unit around them, this is a way that you can sort of start out with it. Okay, so now we're up to our Dystopia book club meetings. The kids have their text, they've made their reading schedule, they've defined dystopia, they have this question sort of prickling in the back of their minds. What are you going to do now? I want to start by saying that figuring out how to run book club meetings can feel tricky. There's the literature circles path, but those are very kind of strict roles. It's a strict structure. In the end, I really don't recommend it for older kids. I think that it's a little bit limiting. You might want to give kids some free rein to talk about their book without just reporting on their roles. But at the same time, you may find that you want some scaffolding, because some kids are definitely going to struggle if you're just like, okay, time to meet and talk about your book. Like that can be a little bit much for some kids. You know your kids best. Some kids can definitely handle that. But I'm going to suggest that you set up your meeting with a combination of 3 elements. Some kind of little discussion warm-up that will help kids be primed for this kind of free talking part of the meeting so they're not totally floating on their own. Then a bit of discussion, and then some kind of activity that you're going to give them to help them explore themes of dystopia. So let's start with those warm-ups. We've talked on here before about discussion warm-ups. I think they're great for whole group discussion as well. They're just a great way to get kids thinking back over their reading. So on any day that you have a book club meeting, you might give kids a short warm-up about anything, whatever you're wanting them to focus on that day. Maybe that's the day that you want to talk about setting, and you're going to give sort of a quick mini lesson on setting. And then you're going to ask everybody to go through the reading and consider the setting of their dystopia. That could come through in a lot of ways. They could search for quotes to do with the setting. They could sketch a little map of the setting. They could choose 5 words that they feel like are the perfect descriptors for the setting, whatever. And then going into the conversation with the group, you might put a question on the board like, how does the setting contribute to the argument or the influence of the text? And ask them to start there. From there, their discussion can go wherever they want, but at least you've given them sort of a jumping off point. it allows you to provide a little bit of direction and hit on any sort of key things you want to be sure to cover with everybody, but then also allow for independent conversation. So this takes care of sort of the first two parts of any book club meeting. You're going to do a warm-up, and then you're going to give them just free time to talk about the book starting from the point of the warm-up. Then maybe you're going to move into some kind of activity. I'm going to give you a bunch of ideas here, okay? I think I've got 5 different possible activities for your Dystopia book clubs. The first one is a collage activity. This is something I've done with 1984 that I found to be very compelling. And it allows kids to kind of make connections between their life, their current events, understanding, and the situation going on in the book. With 1984, it was a very easy connection to make. Depending on the book, it may be easy for your students, or it may take them a little time to process and think about how is life today connected to this dystopia. You can choose to focus the collage just on connections between current events and the dystopia, or maybe on the issue that you feel like the author, or that they feel like the author is trying to get at with the influence in the dystopian world. So, some of them would be very straightforward. Fahrenheit 451 is going to be about sort of freedom to get information, freedom to share information, book banning. They're going to be able to make those connections. And then they're going to search, probably online is going to be easiest, for headlines, for articles, for imagery, illustrations, comics, graphics, infographics that relate to that issue. And they're going to create this visual collage around the issue. This would probably be pretty easy to do on Canva. You know how I feel about Canva, but you could also do it on slides. Kids can just screenshot what they find across the web and then create their collage and maybe make a list of links of all their sources rather than a full sources cited, because this isn't like a giant research project. It's really more of a visual exploration of the issue being addressed in the dystopia. Okay, another activity to help students consider the idea of influence around dystopia is one day in class to allow them to explore the street artist Banksy's exhibition Dismaland. I don't know if you've heard of this. I didn't know too much about it until I was recently doing this research on dystopia, but he created this installation in the UK called Dismaland that was like a dystopian Disneyland, and it's pretty fascinating, and it allows students to sort of consider the question, how is this dystopian art trying to wield influence? How is the influence of art different from the influence of literature? And it again gets at this kind of essential question about influence. How do artists influence people? How does dystopia specifically have a role to play in affecting the way people view things? Okay, another activity is to do a dystopian travel poster. So PBS's Great Read poster series is amazing. We just talked about it in a podcast here. One of their posters invites readers to visit London within the world of 1984. And it's so funny. I mean, it's like, see London, come visit Airstrip 1. There's a quote from Big Brother on it. It is the best place on earth, Big Brother. And so it lets kids sort of consider this idea of setting in a interesting way. Their groups are going to think about, like, what colors do they want in the poster? What type of font? What type of assets of the dystopian world do they want to make sound appealing? What kind of coded warnings might they want to integrate into their poster? And then they're basically just going to create, as a group, different posters that are similarly themed, similarly colored. So at the end, if you have a group of 5, you're going to have 5 different posters inviting people into the world of the book. But they're going to be all along the same lines. Okay, another idea for an activity is to let students examine some propaganda and consider the difference between propaganda, literature, art, and marketing. They're all trying to influence, but where's the line? What's the difference? This is something that I talked about a lot with my students in Bulgaria, because they really felt like 1984 was propaganda. And it really got me thinking, is it? It is creating a profound emotional reaction in my students. Is it propaganda? And if not, why not? And so this is, in my opinion, just very fascinating to talk about with students. Now, the Library of Congress has some World War I posters that are a great example that you can kind of bring up. They're not too extreme, but they are definitely trying to influence their viewer. I've put some in the full show notes at nowsparkcreativity.com, and I'll also link them. So you can see more, but you can show these posters to students, have them explore, and ask again the question, how do these pieces wield influence? Do students find that influence compelling? How is the influence of the propaganda posters the same or different than, say, Banksy's exhibit or the dystopian literature that they're reading? Okay, so those are some different examples of types of activities you could have your book groups do after they do their warm-up and their discussion. I wanted to end by talking a little bit about a possible assessment option, a couple of possible assessment options. As you wrap up your book clubs unit, you're going to want to have students come back to you with their sort of big answers on this big question: how does dystopia wield influence? So one option would just be to have them write. You could do an in-class essay or an out-of-class essay. If you need to focus on argument writing at the moment, I've got a couple of possible prompts for you. And of course, I will put them in the show notes. But so here's the first one. Is dystopia an effective vehicle for influence? How so, or why not? Explore the question through the lens of your book club choice, but feel free to include evidence and examples you've picked up from other books and other artistic pieces as well. So this one really looks at this big question that we've put out throughout the unit. The next one is similar, but it kind of it gets at this question of the line. Where is the line between art and propaganda and marketing and literature that wants to influence you? So the question or the prompt is, what's the difference between art that seeks to influence, marketing, and propaganda? Explore works from throughout the unit, including your book club choice. So I find these questions really fascinating. I think I would really enjoy writing on them. In fact, I have some in the context of my experience in Bulgaria with my students, but you could just do straight writing. But I think another way to go, if you don't have time for a large writing assignment, or if you've just done a large writing assignment and that's not really what your students need right now, is to do an argument one-pager around these same questions. A lot of the activities throughout the unit that I've suggested sort of combine visuals and text. Dismaland, the World War I posters, the image collage, the travel poster. A lot of them are sort of trying to influence with that combination. And so almost parallel would be to do an argument one-pager where students are trying to express their ideas, their argument around influence through both imagery and text. And so that would be the last one that I would propose as an option for assessment. Okay. Are you ready to rock Dystopia book clubs? I know you are. They're a stellar way to give your students choice, and dystopia is such a compelling medium to discuss. Add to that the fact that influence is just a huge question of our time. Our students are following influencers. Our students are sort of considering, who do I want to influence me in my life? I think for all these reasons, dystopia book clubs are a really fascinating option for a curriculum. So I hope today you found some help in terms of possible texts, possible context activities, book club meeting structure, activity options, and even final assessments. Thanks so much for joining me today to talk about dystopia book clubs and all their many possibilities. Until next time, take care of yourself and stay creative.